Our scripture reading this morning is from the Gospel according to Luke, chapters 21 to 30. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.'" And he said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many with a skin disease in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way.
I pray that my words land with you this morning the way that God intends them to. We have quite a Sunday here. February feels like, we finally have some energy. We've seen the sun at least once in the last week. We're like, something is coming, right? We're feeling a little good. We're feeling like something is out there. It's also Groundhog Day for those that celebrate. So Groundhog Day has been a long-standing tradition where a groundhog will emerge from its hibernation in the ground and come out of its den, right? Depending on whether the groundhog sees its shadow when it comes outside, it's determined that either the cold weather will persist for a few more weeks or the warmer weather is around the corner. Now, this holiday started out to be associated with Candlemas, which was a Christian holiday where people would bring their candles to church to have them blessed, which was to bring the blessings then back home for the remainder of the winter. We're sort of right in between the winter and spring equinoxes right now. So the groundhog was added into this tradition from Germany, and then German settlers brought it over to the Americas. The first published report of this tradition in the Americas was in Pennsylvania in 1886, so quite a while ago. Now, what did the groundhog see this morning? I couldn't tell you. But if there was a groundhog in Toronto, surely there would be no shadow. It's quite cloudy. Now imagine being this groundhog. Okay, you've just had the sleep of your life. You are feeling so well rested. You're ready for some food though. You're real hungry. It's been a while since you had some nutrients. You want some water, maybe some fresh air. So you come out of your burrow and there's a whole bunch of people staring at you. Suddenly you have a whole bunch of responsibility. I don't know about you, but when I wake up, I need a little bit of time before I can have some responsibilities, right? People are looking at you for some kind of hope, right? Please tell us that spring is coming. Hoping you're going to bring them the good news that they've been waiting for. What if you bring a message that people don't want to hear? Or you're inviting them into some kind of transformation in this season that's cold and dark and they're not on board. What if you didn't want to perform that day? You said, I'm going back to bed. Would you still be a worthy groundhog? Would they still ask you to come back out? The story of Jesus, as told in this gospel story that we just heard, is about the way that Jesus proclaims who he is, what his purpose is, and the way that his hometown synagogue responds. This is the first time in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus is identified as a prophet, so that's an important detail. And it seems rather fitting then that there's some pushback, right? At first, the people in the synagogue in Nazareth seemed delighted. Oh, great, someone from our town has made it big, right? Surely that means that we are going to get something awesome. We'll see the best miracle of all. He did some wine at that wedding. What is he going to do for us? He must be here to do wonderful things like he has for all those other people. Why else would he have come home? We are his hometown, after all. Jesus pipes into the conversation, anticipating where it's going, and explains that his message of God is beyond the confines of location, religion, culture, lineage. God's grace will be taken beyond this hometown, actually. Beyond our home culture, beyond our home lineage, and I'm not going to do a miracle today, he says. He refers first to the prophet Elijah, who was taken in by this widow from Zarephath, who gave her last bit of flour and oil to bake bread for the prophet. Her son then died, and Elijah pleaded to God to bring him back to life because of the faith that this woman showed him. And God did. Jesus is referring to this story of Elijah witnessing stronger faith from this woman, but that made Elijah unpopular with some Israelites. The second story that Jesus refers to is that of the prophet Elisha, who healed a Syrian war commander general of his leprosy. Because of the faith of the servants of Naaman, he was healed. This is a story of God's grace being spread beyond man-made lines, right, of border, of culture, and other ways that we separate ourselves. This is to amplify his point that no prophet is usually welcome in his hometown. There's usually some kind of conflict or tension, or remember these feelings we were talking about, humans are messy, right, that hasn't really changed over time. They're not really welcome in their hometowns. Both of these prophets brought healing and help to people beyond what was expected of them, beyond their hometowns. The people in the synagogue were filled with rage. We see that word in the story, rage. They cannot believe that their prophet, their Holy One, their hometown hero was not going to do anything for them. That he was preaching about representing a God who will go out and reach people like the widow, like the man with leprosy, like the people that are on the outskirts. He doesn't plan to offer any of these miracles or anything in that he's been doing elsewhere that they've likely heard stories about. He says, I'm not bringing that here. Sorry. Jesus is refusing to act on this power in his hometown. The issue falls not necessarily on the people's belief in Jesus' message that, God's love is all expansive, but it lies in the deeds that he's not going to perform for them. They're angry. We're special. What do you mean? Why won't you show us? The crowd drives him out of the town and to the edge of a cliff. They wanted to see the miracles. They wanted to be shown that they were special and that he was special and came from them. And instead, Jesus comes telling them to trust him and the message that his ministry will continue beyond his hometown. And they felt entitled to the wonders that he was performing, and he humbled them by leaving just as quickly as he arrived. Aside from Groundhog Day, we are in February, of course, so we are now officially in Black History Month. This recognition began as an initiative to remember important people and events in history, becoming a month-long celebration only in the 70s. In 1995, here in Canada, the Honorable Jean Augustine, who was a representative from Etobicoke Lakeshore, so very local for you Toronto people, hometown hero, huh? She made a motion in the House of Commons to officially recognize Black History Month. In 2008, a Senator, Donald Oliver, moved to have the Senate officially recognize the month. It was approved unanimously. The Government of Canada has described the theme for this year's Black History Month to be Black Legacy and Leadership, celebrating Canadian history and uplifting future generations. How can we do this? How can we carry this with us, not just in February? What are we doing? How are we holding that? How are we celebrating history and uplifting future generations? Sounds kind of like what the United Church is asking us to do in the 100th year. As our story of Jesus today highlights, sometimes the message and the way that people perform are unwelcome in the town they're from, or the places where they have lived or ended up. Even more so if there is some tension, some of these messy emotions or expectations of what is to happen. We must learn and we must honor those who came before us and the future generations. We are in this flux, right? We're holding both of these ropes. We must dive into resources that uphold experiences and uplift prayers like the ones we're using today. This book that I will have and you can see later is a connection of prayers and some liturgies from writers all across the global South, which includes many nations in Africa, the Philippines, many nations in South America. And as we've heard so far, we're using some music that has rhythms and beats and words from languages and places of history. How are we being like the people in Jesus' home synagogue, however? Where are our expectations and who are we holding them to? How are we holding them? How are we being like the people watching and waiting for the groundhog? Maybe some of you were waiting for the groundhog this morning. How can we be like Jean and Donald and stand up for this message of love, inclusion, and equity in our communities, even when it might be unpopular? Jesus is remembering Elijah and Elisha, and so who are the prophets that we must remember? We must include Black history in our telling of prophets, of storytellers, and of history makers. Jesus recognized God's transformative power and brought that message to the people. What are the names and stories of prophets in your own life, in your own community, in your own history? How do they point you towards the message that God's Spirit honors and holds the poor, the oppressed, the imprisoned, the indecent? Here are some of the prophets that I am remembering. Viola Desmond, Canadian civil rights activist. Rosemary Sadlier, the founder and president of the Black Canadian Network, former president of the Ontario Black History Society. Violet Pauline King Henry was a Canadian lawyer and activist and was the first Black woman lawyer in Canada, the first Black person to graduate law in Alberta, and the first Black person to be admitted to the Alberta Bar. Mary Ann Camberton Shadd Carey was an anti-slavery activist, journalist, publicist, teacher, lawyer, first Black woman publisher in North America and in Canada. Many names and faces and legacies feed into all of where we are and what we are doing, into our history, into our hometowns. Many have fed us like many fed Jesus. May we continue to hold these prophets in our hearts and honor their legacies, remember our hometown connections and just how far the world reaches beyond our hometowns. May this be so as we move together.